The last line of instructions in a lot of different quilt patterns is to bind as desired. And in my opinion, those instructions leave a lot to be desired. And yes, there are a ton of different ways that you could choose to finish your quilt top, but one of the most traditional methods is to use hand binding. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you all of the steps that I like to take when I'm using a needle and thread to slowly but surely attach that final edge of my binding to the back of my quilt top. This method produces a nice, neat result, which not only looks good and has nearly invisible stitches, but does a really great job of securing that binding for decades to come, which means that you can gift or use your quilt to your heart's desire, knowing that those stitches are not coming undone. Let me show you how it's done. Let me start this whole section with a caveat, and that is that there's no right way or wrong way to do any type of part of quilting, okay? There's no quilt police coming to arrest you for doing the wrong stitches. There's no such thing. What's really important is to find a technique and a method and the tools that work really well for you. So you might watch this section and you might see some of the things I'm using and think, oh, that's a great idea, I'd like to try that. And it might turn out that you don't actually like the tools that I'm using or the methods that I'm using. And that's fine, because as my dad used to always say, it's just as good to know what you don't want to do. If you try a technique and you don't like it, that's great. Now you know that. Now you can find a different way to do that same thing. So let me tell you what tools I like to use in order to do my hand binding. And the good news is, there's not many of them and they're not expensive. So it's a very low entry into trying hand binding. This is my kit, and it's actually a free pattern on the internet. So I'm going to link to this in the description below, and I'm going to put links for every single thing that I can think of in the description below. So in case you see something today and you're like, oh, I want to try that tool, there should be a link for it in the description below. So this is my Goody binding kit. It is so cute and so sweet, and I keep it near my couch at all times because that's where I do my hand binding. So when you unfold the book and you open it up, it's got a nice zippered side that contains really nice, there's lots of room in there that I think is really nice because there's room to hold lots of things. There is a Velcro section that lets you tie down a spool of thread that can slide back and forth, and that's really great because then when you pull the thread off, the spool doesn't, go skittering off. There's a little pocket for scissors. I believe that her pattern had a little way of attaching this with a snap, and I just could not be bothered with that, so I just left it out, and I've never had my scissors come flying out of here, so I wouldn't worry about that. And there's this little felt area that's got two sides. One I use for my needles to hold the needles when I've used them up, and then on the right hand side I use this for a needle minder. And a needle minder, in case you've never seen one before, is just this neat kind of little button thing that is mainly a magnet, and then it's got a piece of metal washer on the back of it. So you sandwich the felt between those two sides of the needle minder, and then the job of this needle minder is to mind your needle. So when I'm done sewing or when I'm putting down my needle, I always just sort of chuck it towards my needle minder, and then the needle minder does a great job of holding on to that needle. So I don't set my needle down somewhere in the folds of the quilt that I'm working on, because that would just lead to me getting poked with it later. I always just set this down on my needle minder and it just snaps to it with a nice magnetic little snap. And you never have to wonder where your needle is because it's always just on your needle minder. And then over on the right hand side, there's a nice pocket area where I keep my needles, and if needed, I keep some binder clips on there as well. And the whole thing comes together. I just used a hair tie, honestly, and it's held up for many, many years of use. So like I said, this is never far from use on my couch. And let me tell you about the products that I have inside. The first thing you're going to need when you're sewing your binding is a needle and thread. And the question is, which one is right for you? And the answer is, I don't know. And you're not going to know either until you try a bunch. I tried a lot of different needles until I found these ones. These ones are straw needles in size 10. So that means they're very small. They're very fine. They're very sharp. I really like that the thin needles pass easily through the layers of the fabric, and the needles are so thin that they actually bend. And that is something that I like. So there's a bit of flex to the needle as I'm moving it through the layers of fabric, and I like that. And that might not be something that you like. That might be something that you actually really dislike, but you won't know until you try. So those are the ones that I use when I'm doing regular hand binding on a quilt like this one. If I was doing big stitch binding, I would be using larger needles like these chenille needles or these embroidery needles, but I don't I don't do that all the time, and in this tutorial, I'm just showing you how to do regular hand binding. So those are my needles. Now for the thread, you need a thread that is thin but strong and somewhat matches the colors in your quilt binding and the back of your quilt. I'm lazy, and I am not going to be changing out this thread every time that I do a different quilt. So I just buy thread in a really neutral color. This one is Aurifil thread in the color 2000. So I think it might be called sand, but this is a 50 weight cotton thread. If you don't have this exact thread, you don't need this exact thread. Just use what you have, but try and use something neutral. For scissors, I don't know where I got these. They're just small little scissors that I probably bought at the counter of a quilt shop 10 to 15 years ago, and they just live in there. My needle minder I would have purchased on Etsy, so I would just recommend doing an Etsy search for a needle minder and just seeing all the different cute options that come up and finding one that works for you. So needles and thread are the two main things that you're going to need, and some way to snip your thread, I guess. But there are also some tools that I like to use now that I'm older, such as this threader. This is a needle threader that I'm going to talk more about in a different section of this video, so I'm not going to say a lot about it now, but it really helps me get that really fine thread into the tiny, tiny eye of my needles. So a needle threader is something that could be very useful for you if your eyes are anything like mine. And I also will use a thimble and a gripper from time to time, but that more or less goes together with the larger needles and the larger thread that I would be using if I was doing big stitch binding. So this is a leather thimble. I tried a lot of thimbles to find one that worked for me. I like this leather one from Clover, and this is a small size. I can see a tiny little S on the side of this thimble, so this is the small size. And I'm using it on my biggest finger, not to be rude, but I'm using it on my biggest finger, except for my thumb, I guess. And when I bought it, I thought, oh, maybe small is going to be too small. And it felt like it barely fit on my finger. Over time, it expanded because it's leather. And now it fits like a glove, like a thimble. But I like this when I'm poking a bigger needle and I'm going through thicker layers of fabric. So a thimble might be useful for you. And I also use this silicone gripper, which I put on my thumb, and that helps me pull the needle. It helps me grip the needle and then pull it through all those layers of thread and fabric when I'm stitching through something that is thicker and like I'm doing big stitch binding. So that's it. That's all I keep in this Goody binding kit. Vanessa, who wrote the pattern, says that you're supposed to use this to put snacks in it. That's what the Goody part is for. But I don't tend to eat snacks, I guess, while I'm binding because my hands are too busy. But it's a cute little kit that just keeps everything neat and tiny and ready to go whenever I'm ready to get sewing. So in the next section, I'm going to be showing you all the steps of putting the binding on, hand stitching it down, from threading the needle, tying knots in it, getting started, stitching along, mitering your corners, and then tying off when the whole thing is finished. So my hope for you with this video is that you're going to learn some new techniques, find something that does in fact work for you, and give you the confidence to get out there and get stitching, because like I said, there's no right or wrong way. Whatever works for you is what works for you. I'm going to show you how I would thread my needle and then tie knots in it in order to make it more secure while I'm stitching. So I'm going to show you with this really large, it's a really large needle. It's a chenille needle, but it's the one that I found in my collection that had the biggest eye possible because this is going to be hard for me to do on screen. And I'm using some thick navy thread so that I can give you a good demonstration. So let me just cut off some of that, move that out of the way. Now, okay. You think, Shelly, I don't need you to show me how to thread a needle. Everybody knows how to do that, right? You just pass the thread through the eye of the needle and then you continue sewing by pinching these two together. But I find that this is a problem for me, believe it or not, because I find when I'm yanking on this and pulling the needle through the layers of the batting and binding, that I often accidentally unthread my needle. And then that's a challenge for me because it's really hard for me to re-thread my needle, because when I'm actually sewing binding on, I'm using tiny, tiny needles with a tiny, tiny eye and tiny thread. And I find it really hard to get those two things back together again. So instead I do something different. And what I do is I will pass a loop through the eye of the needle And maybe this is old news for you, but if it's a new trick, then I'm happy to show you. So I'll pass a loop through the needle of the eye. So now I've got a loop of thread, and you can see that there's a bit of a tail. I'm gonna slide the needle back this way towards the tail end. So it's just sort of, it's dangling there. And now I'm going to pass this needle through the loop. I'm gonna wind it around 1, 2, 3 times. And I'm going to pull this all down till it is behind, I'm just gonna use gentle fingers here, until it's behind the eye of the needle, and then I'm just gonna tighten it up by pulling on these 2 threads. So now that thread is secured there. So I'm pulling on it as hard as I can, and I can't get this to come unthreaded. So yes, this is a small knot, but I find that if you just pass the needle through, 2 to 3 times through the loop and then do that, you end up with a really strong knot that isn't too big that it's hard to pull through all of your layers. It's small enough that it passes through without much difficulty. So in case you're like me and you're constantly unthreading your needle, you might want to give that a try. And you might not like it. You might try it and decide, that's not for me, and that's totally fine, but the joy is trying new things. So that's how I would tie a knot right behind my needle to secure it while I was stitching. But then I also need to tie a knot in the base of my thread. So at the very bottom of my thread, I need to tie a knot. And yes, I could do this, tie it around my finger and try and pass that through, and I would end up with a knot and I could pull that through. But when I'm dealing with tiny thread, one single knot like that is not enough. I find that I need to knot it at least twice, and I find it hard to make the knot on top of the other knot, if that makes any sense. So I find it hard to tie 2 knots consecutively. So instead I've got a trick to show you to tie a knot in the end of your thread. So here I'm going to start with my needle in my right hand and the tip, the end, the tail of my thread in the left, and I'm going to bring them together so they're best friends, and I'm going to hold them together in my right hand. So I'm just securing the tip there. And just like I did a second ago, I'm going to wind the thread around the needle. I'm going to do it 3 times. Then I've got, you can see 3 wraps around the needle. Then I'm going to bunch them together and grab them with my right hand. I'm going to pull them. They just slid over top of that knot, so the knot was not a problem. I'm just going to slide it all the way through until I come to the end, and then ta-da, I've got a knot. And it's like 2 or 3 lumps together, so it's a big enough knot that this is actually going to stay secured in my layers. Should I show you that again? Let me cut that off, and I'll do it again. So I'm holding my needle in my right hand, and I've got the tail end of my thread in my left. I bring them together, hold them together, just pinch them with my right hand, and then wrap the thread around 1, 2, 3 times, bunch them together, grab that knot, slide it now over top of the knot that is behind my needle. Wait, that didn't work. There we go, I got it now. And then just keep pulling, 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 pulling until I come to the end of the thread, and then it's going to, ta-da, tie a knot. And it's a nice big one. One last time just for, to show off, I guess? Sure, why not? I find that when people show me multiple times, it helps me. So again, I've got the needle tip in the right hand, tip the tail of the thread in the left, bring them together. So I'm holding them together, just like that. Hold them together, wrap 1, 2, 3 times, bunch them together. Now, okay, so the problem was that time I let everything go. Let me do it again. So I'm going to hold them together and wrap 1, 2, 3 times. And then I'm going to grab those little twists, pull them over the knot. It should just slide right over the knot that I tied behind my needle, and just pull till the end of my thread. And then I've got a nice thick knot that's just waiting for me to start sewing. So it's all well and good if you're threading a needle that has a large eye, but I am using these tiny little straw needles when I'm actually attaching the binding to my quilts. And I find it very hard to try and thread these things with just my naked eye. Like if you paid me, I don't know, if you said, Shelly, I'll give you $100,000 right now if you can thread this on the first try, I don't think I would be able to do it, to be honest with you. Nope, that was my first try and we missed. Okay, so I've established it's hard for me to do this because my eyes, because I'm old, I don't know why, but it's hard for me to do. And that is why I use my needle threader. So mine is antique, vintage, I don't know what to call it. I just found it one day in a sewing machine repair shop and Buddy sold it to me for like $3. But there are newer versions than this on the internet, and I will link them in the description below. But how this works is I'm gonna take my needle with the eye facing down, so the eye is down, and I'm gonna drop it into this smaller of the two holes. So this is a bigger hole, this is a smaller hole. Because I'm using a small needle, I'm going to put it into the smaller hole. And I'm sure that the newer versions out there of this tool have got instructions that come with them. So if they're slightly different than mine, you know, don't at me, just read the instructions on yours. But I just want to show you this in case this is like you didn't know that this tool existed and it's going to change your life maybe. So I'm going to lay the thread over top of this little notch and just gently hold it in place with my 2 fingers. And then I'm going to push this little nub end over, and it has, believe it or not, pushed a loop of thread through the needle. So now when I pull this out, and I have to pull the thread all the way through this, so it's got to travel all the way through the little machine. Now, when I look at my, I'm going to try and untangle things here. When I look at my thread and my needle, I've got a loop that's been pulled through. So that's great for me because I'm going to use this and pass my needle through this loop several times. But if you didn't want that loop in there, you could just pull out the tail, and now you've got a threaded needle with a short tail on it. And you can make that tail just a little bit shorter if you wanted to, and then you could just get to sewing from here. But if you're like me and you like to use that loop, then I'll show you how I do that. So I've got to rethread it again. Let me get the machine back out. Needle eye goes down, the thread goes across this throat. There's like a knot in here or something. Yeah, needle goes, the thread goes across the throat. I punch that through. I've got a tiny little loop that just passed through. I'm just gonna pull that out a little bit more so it's less dangerous when I pull this needle out. Pull the needle out, pull all the thread out. And now I've got my needle with a loop. And that's where I'm going to pass this needle through 3 times and then slide those behind the needle and just pull the threads tighter. And then I've got a tiny little knot that was tied behind my needle, and now this is secure and I can yank on this end and it's not going to come unthreaded as I start stitching. So that's how I use a needle threader, and if that was a new tool to you, you are welcome. I've got my quilt binding that's been attached to the front of my quilt, and now I'm going to be rolling that binding around to the back and attempting to cover up this line of stitches, which is where I've attached it to the front. So I wouldn't want to stitch down my binding like this because you'd be able to see that line of stitches. Instead, I'm going to roll the binding a little bit further so it covers that line of stitches. And the first thing you might notice is that there's a lot of fluffies, a lot of extra threads, and that's fine. I think it's really normal. I'm just going to smooth them down. So I find that I can just sort of wipe them down and they kind of get out of my way. Now I've got my thin straw needle. It's got a knot tied behind the eye, and I've got a knot tied in the tail end of this. And I'm working with about 18 inches of thread, I would say. So the more thread that you pull out, the higher the chances are you're going to develop a knot the more that you keep pulling this through fabric. So I like to work with about 18 inches. And I'm going to start on the back side, and I'm going to bury my knot by poking this needle in right about where this line of stitches is. Now when I pull the needle to the back of the quilt and pull that through, now my knot, which is right here, has been secured, and it's going to just disappear and I'll never see that again. Now I'm going to roll the binding to the back of the quilt, and you'll see that my thread is coming straight down. Like if I pull it straight down, I can see that it's right about there. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to take a stitch in this binding fabric, and I'm going to bring it up approximately like straight above where I have inserted that in the first place. So I'm just going to take one, and you notice I'm not using binding clips because, as I keep saying, I find them annoying, but I'm just going to take one tiny little stitch into this binding fabric, and I'm going to try and stitch, poke the needle in as close as I can to the fold. So I don't want to poke it in over here because that's going to leave me with a really big, really obvious stitch. Instead, I'm going to poke it in as close as I can to the fold of that binding. I'm going to pull that through, and when I pull it tight, now my very first stitch is secure. Now I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to poke directly below where I just put that in, and this time I'm poking into the backing fabric. And I'm trying to catch a little bit of the batting at the same time, and then I'm going to travel across about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to poke the needle out into the fold of the binding one more time, and then that is going to secure that. And I'm just going to keep folding and going along and taking more stitches. So I'm just traveling about 1/4 of an inch every time. And again, I don't really have a way of measuring this, so I don't really know exactly how far away they are, but I would say they're about anywhere between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch. And every time I'm trying to take tiny little stitches. And because I've used this neutral thread, which is kind of matching or at least blending with the project that I'm working on, those stitches are nearly invisible. And sometimes it happens that as I'm stitching, it feels like it's harder to push through. And so if I was trying to take a little bite right there, I might flip over the fabric and see, I don't know if you can see the glint of my needle there, but that means that I actually poked too far. So when I was trying to take this stitch, I actually poked my needle through all the way to the back, or to the front actually. So I poked my needle through to the front, and that's not what I want. So if I noticed that, I would take the needle back out, and then I would simply redo that stitch. It does sometimes happen that I'm stitching along, and then I'll look at the front of the quilt and I'll see that I made a little boo-boo, like a mistake, 6 inches past, and there's a tiny little stitch that's on the front of the quilt. And again, if you pick a thread color that kind of matches with the project that you're working on, it won't be very noticeable. So if I see that I made a mistake 6 inches ago, I'm not going back to fix it. But if I notice as I'm stitching, then yes, I am going to just pull that needle back out and take that stitch again. So I'm just going to keep stitching along, just showing you again and again how I take these stitches. They're quite small, and using this really thin, really flexible needle I find helps me get those nice stitches going. Sometimes I poke myself, and that I would say that happens pretty regularly. And again, I'm not using a thimble or a gripper because I don't find that I need it for this thin of a needle. And when I'm just poking through just quilting cotton like this, I don't find that I need either one of those. And it seems like when I really get into a rhythm, it's not fast, I wouldn't say, but it definitely goes by somewhat effortlessly because I kind of get into a rhythm and it becomes like, I don't know, I don't want to say the word meditative, but it definitely is relaxing to sit on a couch and work on a quilt. And every now and then I'll come across some threads like these ones right here. I'm just going to tuck them up inside so I don't notice them. I'm stitching up to an area where there was a join in the binding fabric. So if you can see right here, this is a join in my binding fabric. So it's quite a bit thicker as I'm stitching here. So you might notice that it's harder to get that needle through because you have to go through a lot more layers all of a sudden. And when I'm stitching around a join like this, I'm going to make sure that my needle is poking out either to the right or to the left of this seam, but I'm not going to poke my needle directly into a seam like this because I feel like it's kind of a weak point. There's just not as much fabric there. It's like there's a gap in the fabric. So instead I'm going to poke out, this time I did it on the right, and now I'm going to just come to the left of that area. And then I'll just keep stitching along until I come to a corner. And when I get over there, I'll show you how I handle that. I'm coming up to this corner, and I'm just going to show you how I get a nice tight mitered corner. So I'm going to just keep stitching my binding along until I come to the point where this line, this is a line of stitches where it was attached to the front of the quilt on this leg, and I'm going to stitch right up until I come right until this point. So I'm going to be really careful with the way I do that. I want to make sure that I've got one little stitch that comes right into this point right here. So I don't want to take one big one here. I'm going to take two small ones. I'm just going to make sure that I end up in that corner. That is important for the success of this strategy. So I'm going to take one more little small bite, and I'm going to come up right in that corner. So I'm making sure that my needle is right where it needs to be. Now I'm going to somewhat turn my work, and I'm going to place my needle horizontally like so. I'm going to fold this over, fold over this leg until they meet neatly in this corner right here. And this is the one and only time when I would use a binder clip. And I'm just going to clip that in place so it holds still while I do the next couple of things here. So from here, I'm going to, it actually looks to me like this was maybe not quite as far down as I needed it to be. So I'm just going to refold that. There we go. I want to make sure that it's a really crisp kind of connection right in that corner. So I'm going to clip that down and find my needle, which I set down somewhere. Here we go. And now, let me get some of this out of the way. I'm going to take one tiny stitch right here, and I'm going to come up in the corner of this piece of fabric right here. So I'm going to take a tiny, tiny stitch, like I've been doing all along, and then I'm going to come up as close to that corner as I possibly can. And that's going to ensure that those two stitches, or at least that point, is going to join beautifully. So now I've got a really sharp point here where these two pieces of binding fabric are meeting. And I could just carry on and keep stitching down this leg, but if I do that, then this flap, there's like a flap here underneath, and I find that that can kind of wear over time, so I want to make sure that I'm taking the time to stitch that down. And I'm going to do that exactly the same way that I've been doing all of the stitching thus far, and I'm going to do that by doing invisible stitches, but this time I'm just going to be doing it between these two edges here of this binding. So I'm taking small stitches, and then I'm going to move this little clip back a little bit. I'm going to come straight across, travel a small amount, and then come up in the fold in the binding on the left leg, attach that down, and I'm going to do one more, but I don't necessarily need the clip for that. So I'm going to go right in here, travel a small distance, and then come up in the fold on the left-hand side. And I don't find that I need to go right to the very tip because the tip kind of takes care of itself. So now I'm going to insert my needle on the right-hand side, and I'm going to travel down through the layers of fabric, and I'm going to poke out again at this very corner. So I'm going to make sure that I'm doing a good job in poking out right in the corner. That looks really good to me. So I'm going to poke out into that corner, pull my thread through, and that has secured that corner nicely. Then I'm just going to sort of turn my work like I did before. I'm going to hide any fuzzies and bits of extra thread under there that I don't need. And now I'm just going to keep stitching along this side, doing it exactly as I was doing before. So I'll start by taking one small stitch right in this corner. And then I'm just coming out into the fold of that, oops, hit the camera, into the fold. And that's how I get a really nice tight looking mitered corner on the back of the quilt, and it looks very nice on the front as well. Ta-da! Let's say you're stitching along and you are coming to the end of your thread, because that's going to eventually happen to you sooner or later. And most of the time you're going to end and this will not be finished, but I just happen to be coming up to the spot where I started attaching this. So you can see these little stitches right here are the ones that were the first stitches that I put in. And so now I'm just finishing up. And whether I'm just running out of thread as per normal, or if I'm coming to the end of my quilt, the way that I tie off is exactly the same, with one very small difference. So let me just show you that. So I'm stitching along, and if I was just at the end of my rope, no, at the end of my thread right here, I would tie off and finish this. But I don't want to finish and leave a gap, so I'm going to take another couple of stitches here, and I'm actually going to go past the point, oh, I've got a bit of a knot there. I'm actually going to go past the point where I started stitching. So I'm going to keep on taking little tiny stitches, and I'm going to go past the part where I started. So I'm going to come out over here to the left of where I started, and that's going to be where I tie off. And that just feels like extra security, because then I know for sure that this is tied down. Okay, so how I will finish is I'm going to take a couple of very small bites, kind of exactly where my thread is. So instead of traveling, I'm going to poke the needle into the backing fabric, and I'm just going to come straight up again into the binding fabric, kind of as close as I can to that fold. And I'm going to take the thread and wrap it around my needle. And that is because I'm essentially, what I'm doing is it's like I'm creating a loop in the thread, and then I have pulled my thread through that loop. So I'm going to give that a tug, and it's going to create a tiny little knot right there that is barely visible. And I'm going to do one more just to be super duper sure. Another tiny little bite coming out through the fold in the binding. Wrap that thread around my needle. So I'm wrapping the tail around my needle and pull that through. So it's like I have a loop and my thread is coming through that loop. I'm just going to tie that down real tight. So I'm going to give it a good tug so it feels nice and secure. Now from here I'm going to just basically disappear my thread by pushing it through here. But before I do that, I'm going to tie another knot just to be super duper sure. So I'm going to use my hands and tie like a big loop, just sort of a, I don't even know what we call this, a simple, very simple knot. And I'm going to take that knot and just bring it down close to the tail of my thread that I'm working on. So I've got a knot that's down there, and but it's really small. So I'm going to take I'm going to make another loop, pardon me, pass my thread through the loop, and then just make sure that my second knot ends up on top of my first knot. I'm just tying it very tightly down there. So it's probably hard to see on camera, but there's two small knots tied right on top of each other. I'm going to poke the needle into the backing fabric, and I'm just going to not stab myself, but instead I'm going to come out just anywhere in the fold of the backing fabric. And when I pull on this, I'll be able to feel my knot catch right there, and then I'm just going to give it a little tug. There we go, until I feel it sort of pop into that area there. I'm going to reach and find my scissors. I'm going to give this a little tug, this thread, just a bit of tension on it, give it a cut, and then now that's disappeared forever and ever. My instinct is always to bring it closer to the camera, but it doesn't work that way. So that's how I would finish off, whether I was finishing like for real for the end of the quilt, or if I was just running out of thread and finishing off. And then I'll show you how to get started again. Every time you tie off, you have to start again. So here I am, I've come to the point where my previous stitches are holding this down, but I've got to restart. So my final stitch looks like it was right about here, and I'm going to start again somewhere over here on the right. So just to be really super sure that that is secure, I'm going to start over here rather than just starting over here and heading to the left. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to take my needle and traveling from left to right, I'm going to insert it, insert it. I poke myself a lot while I'm doing this. And I'm coming out, the goal here is to come out into the binding just in the fold, but I'm doing this over to the right of where my final stitches were. And that's going to bury my knot with its long tail. It's going to get buried underneath here, underneath this binding. So I feel like these last stitches are maybe not all that secure. So I'm going to do just a couple of stitches right here, just to really secure this area, because what I don't want is for my stitching to come undone. So I'm going to do kind of like I did at the ending, wrap that thread around, and I'll just maybe do that one, and I think that that's probably good enough to secure it. And then I'm just going to carry on. I'm going to take stitches to the left, and I'm stitching in between where my previous stitches were, so that I'm not piling up thread in any particular area. And then I'm just going to keep carrying on from here. So it's pretty easy to restart. And you might find a method that works better for you. Maybe you like to put in multiple stitches when you start. That's totally fine. It's just fun to try new things and see what works best for you and experiment and see. Oh, okay, here's something I did. I accidentally went through this loop. So I don't know if you can see that, but I've accidentally sewn through this loop. So I need to pull my thread back through this loop, like so. That should free it, I believe. There we go. That turned out much better. That happens too, I guess. And the reason that I don't use clips is I find that I often just, I get caught on them a lot. That's something that happens to me, is that my thread loop just gets caught on those clips and I get frustrated all the time. So instead, it's a clipless life for me. And that's how I would restart after having tied off. I think that hand binding a quilt is one of the most fun ways to finish your project. And yes, it's true that it's not the fastest method, but I really like that it gives me extra time to spend with my quilt, showing it a little bit of extra love before I gift it, or wash it, or hang it, or use it. And if you saw this quilt and you thought you wanted to make one just like it, great news! I've got a video tutorial all about making the checkered garden quilt, which is what this pattern is. In that video, I show you great time-saving techniques that are going to help you put this together in a flash, and I've got a great pressing technique that's going to help all your blocks come together perfectly. As always, I'm wishing you happy quilting, and I'll see you in my next video.